The signal arrived on a Tuesday, which felt wrong. Not because Tuesdays held any cosmic significance, but because the people who received it had spent years imagining this moment as something grander, a Sunday at dawn, perhaps, or a moment lit by lightning. Instead, it came at 3:17 in the afternoon while Dr. Maravas was eating a sandwich at her desk at the Atacama Large Millimeter Array in northern Chile, and her first thought was not wonder. It was, "The antenna is broken again." She set down the sandwich. The signal was not noise. That was the first thing that separated it from everything they had collected in 30 years of listening. Noise had texture but no intention. It piled up in frequencies like sediment, random and patient and cold. What was arriving now had the opposite quality. It had the feel of something that knew it was being heard. She called her colleague Renato, who came in from the adjacent room still holding his coffee, and they stood together in front of the readout for almost 4 minutes without speaking. The waveform on the screen had a periodicity that should not have existed in any natural emission source. It repeated, but not mechanically. Each cycle varied slightly. The way a sentence spoken aloud varies slightly from its written form, as if the thing transmitting it was breathing. "Get Lehman," Mara said. Renato left. She did not take her eyes off the screen. Dr. Emil Lehman was the array's director, a German astrophysicist in his late 50s who had published 4 books on the philosophy of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence and who privately believed they would never find anything. He arrived in the monitoring room 6 minutes later with his coat still half on and stood where Renato had stood and did what they had both done, said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Is it localized?" "Yes," Mara said. "Sector 4, right ascension 18 hours 29 minutes. Declination minus 14.8 degrees. Deep field. Very deep." Lehman put his coat the rest of the way on. "How deep?" "That's the thing," she said. "The angular position suggests a source beyond the local group, which would put it at minimum 2 million light-years distant. But the signal strength is..." She paused because what she was about to say violated several physical laws she had committed to memory as a graduate student. "The signal strength is consistent with a source approximately 40 meters away." Lehman looked at her. "That's what it says," she told him. He looked at the screen. "Run diagnostics." "Already running. Everything is functioning within normal parameters." "Run them again." She ran them again. The equipment was fine. The signal was not. Within 72 hours, the information had reached 6 other observatories on 4 continents. Not through official channels. Official channels would have taken weeks, but through the informal network of researchers who called one another at odd hours when something was wrong with the sky. By the end of the week, every major radio telescope on the planet was pointed at the same coordinates, and all of them were receiving the same transmission. The signal was not just a signal. This became clear within days of sustained analysis. Embedded in its structure were layers, frequency modulations nested inside amplitude variations nested inside phase shifts, each layer carrying distinct information, the way a human voice carries not just words but tone and breath and the biological history of a particular throat. When the outermost layer was decoded, which took a team at SETI's Mountain View office approximately 4 days, it resolved into a mathematical framework. Prime numbers first, then geometric proofs, then something that appeared to be a coordinate system referencing our own solar system from the outside, as if drawn by someone watching from a great distance with perfect eyes. That alone would have been extraordinary. What was in the deeper layers was something else entirely. The second layer contained physics. Not the physics humanity already knew, arranged differently. New physics, formulated in a mathematical notation system that took 3 weeks to fully parse, describing phenomena for which no experimental evidence existed and no theoretical framework had prepared anyone. One set of equations described what the translation team began calling negative causality, a process by which effects could propagate backward through time not randomly but selectively, seeking out their own causes the way water seeks low ground. Another described a class of particles that did not interact with spacetime in any conventional sense, that existed in what the notation suggested was a kind of orthogonal dimension, not parallel, not adjacent, but perpendicular to the dimensions in which all known matter resided. A third set of equations described the conditions under which something could exist without having ever been created. That third set of equations was the one that made people quiet. The signal's third layer was harder to characterize. It was not physics and it was not mathematics, though it used both. It was something closer to narrative, not fiction, not history, but something that functioned like both simultaneously. It described, in a notation the translation team was still only partially certain they understood, a sequence of events. The events had no names attached, no locations in any framework the translators could map to known space. But they had shape. A beginning that was also a middle that was also an ending that pointed back to something that had not yet happened and perhaps never would. The teams working on this layer worked in rotating shifts and almost none of them slept well. The military arrived on day 19. Mara had expected them sooner. In the scenarios she had run in her head during those first strange days, the soldiers came immediately, black vehicles and serious faces before the first analysis was even complete. Instead, what arrived was more measured and, in some ways, more unsettling. Two men in civilian clothes who introduced themselves with names that felt chosen rather than inherited, accompanied by a woman from the National Security Agency named Carver, who shook hands with a directness that suggested she had spent considerable time learning to project confidence. They did not take over the facility. They asked questions. This was, Mara decided, more dangerous than if they had simply commandeered everything, because it meant they were thinking carefully. Carver's questions were precise. She wanted to know the exact moment of first detection. She wanted to know whether any equipment had behaved anomalously before the signal's arrival, anything, however small, that might indicate preparation or intrusion. She wanted to know whether the signal's source coordinates corresponded to any catalogued object. On that last point, Mara's colleague Dr. Ji-won Park, a Korean astronomer who had joined the analysis team on day 5, produced a printed page and set it on the table. "We checked against every catalog," Ji-won said. Hubble Deep Field Archives, the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, the Vera Rubin Observatory datasets, the James Webb Archive going back to the beginning of its operational life. We checked against every wavelength, optical, infrared, X-ray, gamma, radio across the full spectrum. And Carver said, "There is nothing there," Ji-won said. Not nothing as in a faint source below detection threshold. Nothing as in the complete absence of any detectable matter. No star, no galaxy, no gas cloud, no dust concentration, no dark matter signature. We're pointing at a region of space that our best instruments tell us is categorically empty. Carver looked at the page. So the signal is coming from empty space. The signal is coming from a location where empty space is, Ji-won said carefully. Perhaps not quite the right description. Carver looked up. Empty space is not truly empty, Ji-won continued. There are quantum fluctuations, virtual particle pairs, the cosmic microwave background. If you look at a region of space carefully enough, you can always find something. We found nothing. Not the absence of something, the absence of the substrate in which something could exist. The coordinates resolve to a location where, as best as our instruments can determine, the vacuum itself does not exist. One of the two men, who had not given real names, wrote something in his notebook. The other stared at the table. "How is that possible?" Carver asked. "It isn't," Ji-won said. General Marcus Webb arrived on day 31 by military transport and did not pretend to be in civilian clothes. He was a large man who had fought in 2 wars and advised on 3 more, who had developed over a career the useful habit of making decisions in the presence of information he did not fully understand. He had been briefed extensively on the signal before arriving, and his first action upon landing was to request a private meeting not with the scientists but with their notes. He spent 4 hours alone with printed copies of the translation team's work and emerged changed in a way he would not have been able to articulate. Something about the notation system, which he could not read and made no pretense of understanding, had nonetheless communicated something to him. He described it later, in a classified briefing, as the experience of looking at a word in a language you don't speak and somehow understanding it anyway, not through logic but through some older and less reliable faculty. He requested a translator. Mara was assigned to him, a decision she resented and then reconsidered. Webb was not what she had expected from the briefings about his arrival. He asked questions that came from an unexpected angle, questions that a physicist would not have asked because a physicist would have been too focused on the physics. Webb wanted to know about intention. He wanted to know what kind of mind would send this particular message, structured this particular way, at this particular moment. "We can't know that," Mara said. "We can barely characterize the message. Understanding the sender would require." "Humor me," Webb said. She thought about it. "The message is extraordinarily well structured," she said. "Every layer is legible by something with the right mathematical framework. It's almost pedagogical. It teaches you to read it as you read it. That suggests a sender who was thinking about the recipient, who modeled, at some level, what the recipient could and couldn't understand. So it was designed for us. It was designed for something at our level of comprehension. Whether it was designed for us specifically, Webb said, may be the most important question we can ask." He paused. Outside the facility's window, the Atacama Desert was burning with late afternoon light, the sky above it a blue so deep and dry it seemed mineral rather than atmospheric. "Because if it was designed for us specifically," he said, "then someone knew we would be here. Knew we would receive it. Knew what we could understand and what we couldn't. And that means someone knew about us before we knew about them." He turned from the window. "Before we knew about ourselves, perhaps." On day 44, Dr. Yusuf Adeyemi published the first of what would become 3 papers, though only the first was ever finished in the conventional sense. The second was completed by his colleagues after he left the project under circumstances that were never fully explained, and the third existed only as a set of handwritten notes found in his apartment. The first paper described a mathematical property of the signals encoding that had been overlooked in the scramble to decode content. The encoding itself, the method by which the signal's information was embedded in its carrier wave, was not a known system. It was not an unknown system of the type that human cryptographers would have designed, either, sharing none of the structural preferences that human encoding systems historically exhibited regardless of their underlying logic. It was something else, something that used mathematical operations not as tools toward a goal but as the goal itself, as if the information and the form of its transmission were not two things but one. The implication Adeyemi drew from this was uncomfortable. The message could not have been designed by anything with a history. Every intelligent encoding system in human experience bore the marks of its development, compromises made, paths not taken, the weight of previous attempts. This one had none of that. It was not the product of refinement. It appeared fully formed, without ancestors, without earlier drafts. "It is," he wrote in a passage that was quoted widely and then disputed widely, "as if the message did not evolve toward its current state but rather arrived in it, complete, from some condition in which evolution is not a relevant process." He submitted the paper on a Thursday. By Saturday, he had received 43 responses, 31 of which were hostile and 12 of which were from people who had noticed the same thing and had not yet found the courage to write it down. Mara began keeping a notebook on day 50. Not for the project, she had official logs and data records in abundance, but for herself, for the things she noticed that did not fit the categories of scientific observation. The first entry, dreamed about the notation system. In the dream I could read it fluently. Woke up and couldn't remember a single character. The fifth entry, G1 says she has started dreaming in the notation too. So has Renato. We haven't compared notes with the other facilities yet, but I suspect this is not unique to us. The ninth entry, the signal has not changed in 51 days. Not by a single bit. Whatever is sending it is either broadcasting on a fixed loop or knows, impossible, exactly how long to sustain transmission. But here is what I noticed today that I cannot put in the official record. The signal is not recorded the same way twice. We run the same analysis algorithm on the same archived data and the results differ slightly. Not randomly, they differ in a consistent direction, as if the archived data is slowly being rewritten. As if the past of the signal is changing. The 13th entry, am I the right person to be here? The philosophical community had its own eruption on day 60, triggered by Adeyemi's paper and several others that followed in its wake. The argument was ancient but had never before been pressurized by actual evidence. If something existed, it had to have a cause. If it had a cause, it had a history. If it had a history, it had a beginning. A message could not come from nothing. The sender had to have existed, whatever the astronomical evidence showed. But the astronomical evidence was unambiguous and was now confirmed by 17 independent facilities using different instruments and different analysis methodologies. The coordinates were empty in a way that went beyond merely containing no visible matter. 3 separate teams had attempted to probe the region with high-energy radio pulses to check for absorption or reflection, and the pulses had not returned. They had not been absorbed. They had not been reflected. They had simply failed to reach their destination, as if the destination did not occupy a position in the same space through which the pulses traveled. The philosopher Dr. René Marchetti, speaking at a hastily assembled conference in Geneva, put the problem in terms that subsequently became the standard framing: we have a message without a sender, a signal without a source, a transmission from a location that does not exist. Ordinarily, we would call this impossible and move on. We are not able to move on because the message is undeniably here. It is in our instruments, in our archives, increasingly in our minds. The fact of its reception is not in question, only its origin. And so we are left with a logic that has no room for us. Something is communicating from a state of non-existence. She paused. The conference room was very quiet. But perhaps, she said, that is not quite right. Perhaps the question is not where the sender is. Perhaps the question is when, and whether when is even the right framework. The equations in the signal's second layer describe conditions under which something can exist without ever having been created. What if those equations are not instructions? What if they are a description? What if the sender is telling us not how to build something impossible, but what it itself is? The changes began subtly, which was perhaps how they had to begin. Subtlety was a function of scale. The larger the thing that was changing, the more gradually any individual's perception adjusted to accommodate it. On day 70, 3 separate incidents were reported at 3 separate analysis facilities that would not have been connected by anyone paying insufficient attention. At the array in Chile, a graduate student named Flores reported that a wall in the monitoring room appeared to have a seam it had not had before, a thin, almost invisible line running from floor to ceiling, as if the wall were a door that had been sealed so thoroughly the frame had nearly been absorbed. She mentioned it to Renato, who looked at the wall for a long time and said he didn't see what she was describing. He looked long enough that she doubted herself and said nothing more. At the facility in New Mexico, a senior researcher named Okonkwo printed a section of the third layer's narrative framework and compared it to the version he had printed 2 weeks prior. The 2 printouts should have been identical: same data, same algorithm, same printer. They were not. The version from 2 weeks prior described an event sequence in which something ended. The version from today described an event sequence in which something began. He checked the digital files. Both versions existed in the archive, time-stamped 2 weeks apart, as if the older version had always said what it now said. In Beijing, a data analyst named Zhu noticed that the star catalog used as reference for the signal's coordinates, the same catalog used by observatories worldwide, updated continuously from satellite data, contained a new entry. Not a new star. The entry was for the coordinates themselves, the empty region, listed without designation or classification, but with a set of properties that included mass, spectral type, distance, and an age, 13.8 billion years, exactly as old as the universe. Zhu reported this to her supervisor. The entry was gone by the next morning. When she searched the archive for the record of the change, she found that the archive showed no record of any entry ever having existed, but the space where the entry had been contained an absence that was slightly, imperceptibly different from the surrounding data, the way a picture frame leaves a mark on a wall after being removed. On day 88, General Webb requested that Mara join him for a walk. This was unusual. Webb conducted all his meetings in enclosed spaces, a habit she had attributed to either security protocols or temperament. They walked in the afternoon heat of the desert, the facility shrinking behind them, the salt flats stretching out in every direction like the floor of a drained world. "Tell me what you actually think," he said. Not as an order, exactly. More as an invitation extended by someone who had grown tired of receiving answers designed for official records. Mara walked for a moment without answering. A bird she didn't recognize was circling overhead. She had been in the Atacama for 6 years and had never seen that particular bird before. "I think the message is not a message," she said. Webb looked at her. "I think we've been treating it as communication, as one intelligence reaching out to another, because that's the framework we have. SETI was always looking for a message. So when something arrived that had the structural properties of a message, we filed it there." She stopped walking. But messages assume 2 already existing parties. A sender and a receiver, both present before the exchange begins. The signal's second layer describes conditions under which existence can originate from non-existence. The third layer describes an event sequence, a narrative, that doesn't have a fixed direction. That can be read from either end. What does that mean? What if it's not describing something that happened? She said. What if it's describing something that is happening? What if the transmission is not a record but a process, and we are part of that process, and the signal is not reporting our existence but generating it? Webb was quiet for a moment. Overhead, the unknown bird made a sound she had no category for. "You're saying we might not have existed before the signal," he said. "I'm saying the signal arrived from somewhere that by all evidence has never existed," she said. "And since it arrived, things that should not be are. The entries in star catalogs. The archives that rewrite themselves. The notation that appears in people's dreams. The wall." She paused. "You know about the wall." "I know about the wall," he said. "The signal is propagating something," she said. "Not information. Something structural. It is changing the substrate. Slowly, carefully, as if it knows how much change a system can absorb before it notices and resists." She turned to face the direction the signal came from, which was a habit she had developed without meaning to, the way a plant turns toward light. "It's not reaching out to us. It's reaching into us." Adeyemi's second paper, the one completed by colleagues after he left, contained a section he had outlined but not written, filled in by others based on his notes and conversations. The section described something the team had taken to calling the recursion problem. The signal's mathematical framework, when applied to itself, when used as both the tool of analysis and the object being analyzed, produced a peculiar result. The framework described, among other things, the conditions for its own origin. Specifically, it described a class of structures that could only arise as the product of analysis conducted by a sufficiently complex cognitive system, but that had to predate any such system in order for the system to arise in the first place. The chicken and the egg, except that neither the chicken nor the egg existed until you looked at the other one. Adeyemi's notes for this section contained a single line that his colleagues included verbatim because none of them could agree on what it meant and none of them felt comfortable omitting it. "The signal is not older than us. We are not older than the signal. The signal is the interval between those two statements and everything that happens in it." On day 112, Mara was alone in the monitoring room at 3 o'clock in the morning, which was where she spent most of her nights now, and the signal changed. Not in content. In direction. She checked the coordinates 3 times, then called G1, who arrived in 6 minutes with her hair still compressed from a pillow on one side. 493 days the signal had arrived from a fixed point. Right ascension 18 hours 29 minutes, declination minus 14.8 degrees, somewhere beyond the local group in a location where space itself appeared to be absent. That point had not shifted by a single arcsecond despite the rotation of the Earth and the motion of the solar system through the galaxy, which meant either the source was genuinely extragalactic and thus effectively fixed relative to any motion on our scale, or the source was somehow tracking the planet. Now the signal was coming from everywhere. Not a diffuse broadcast that had spread across the sky. Not a source that had moved. The signal's origin, according to every instrument they had, was simultaneously every point on the celestial sphere. It was coming from all directions at once, arriving in phase, coherent, structured, the same transmission from every location in the sky, as if the source had expanded to encompass the universe itself, or, more precisely, as if the source was something that the universe was now inside of. G1 looked at the data for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, "It moved." "It didn't move," Mara said. "It expanded." "Same thing." "No," Mara said. "If it moved, it went from somewhere to somewhere else. This didn't. This," she stopped. "This stopped having a location." G1 sat down. "What does that mean?" Mara looked at the readout. "I don't know. But I think it's telling us something. I think it changed because something changed. Something crossed a threshold." She paused. "I think enough people have read enough of it. I think it reached," she searched for the word, "critical mass." G1 said nothing for almost a minute. Then, critical mass of what? Mara thought about the equations in the second layer, the ones describing existence without creation. She thought about the wall with the seam. She thought about her dreams, in which she moved through spaces made of the notation system, rooms whose walls were mathematical and whose floors were the deep logic of something that had no ancestors. She thought about the bird she didn't recognize. "Of us," she said. "Of minds that have processed it. I think it's been working toward something, and I think we just passed the number it needed." She turned to G1. How many people have access to the full translation? Ji-won thought. Officially, around 300. Unofficially, she paused, the first layer decode has been on the internet for 60 days. The second layer partial translation has been circulating for 3 weeks. Millions of people. Then it has millions of processors, Mara said. All of them carrying pieces of it. All of them running the notation in their dreams, making small local changes that... She stopped again because the thought was too large for the sentence she had been constructing. That add up, Ji-won said. That add up, Mara confirmed. She flew to Geneva without telling Webb. She needed to speak with Marchetti, who was the only philosopher she had encountered in this entire process who seemed to be asking the right questions rather than the inevitable ones. They met in a cafe near the lake, and Mara arrived with her notebook and the collected unofficial observations she had been building for weeks and spread them on the table without preamble. Marchetti, who was 71 and had the specific patience of someone who had spent decades waiting for a problem worth solving, looked at everything Mara had brought without touching it. You've worked out where it comes from, she said. No, Mara said. I've worked out that the question is wrong. Where implies a place. When implies a time. Both imply a framework of existence. It doesn't come from within any framework of existence. It comes from, she paused. From the condition prior to frameworks, Marchetti said. Mara looked at her. You've been there too. I've been thinking about nothing else for 4 months, Marchetti said. She picked up a copy of Adeyemi's line, the signal is the interval, and held it. He was almost right. But he was still thinking about intervals as things that exist within time. An interval between 2 points, contained in the timeline along which both points are located. She set it down. What if the sender is the interval itself? What if it is not located between 2 points but is the relationship between them, the thing that makes it possible for 2 points to be distinct from each other at all? Mara said, I don't know what that would be. No, Marchetti said. But I think the signal does. And I think it's trying to tell us. Not to inform us. Telling implies we're separate from the information. I think it's trying to, she looked at the lake, include us. Include us in what? Marchetti looked back. In itself. On day 131, an event occurred that was classified immediately and remained classified for a period long enough that the people who eventually had it explained to them found it almost impossible to believe it had been kept secret. A team of physicists at a facility that was never named in any public document had been working on the equations from the signal's second layer, the negative causality equations, the ones describing effects that sought their own causes. They had been attempting to test them experimentally, which everyone had agreed was premature and possibly dangerous, and which they had done anyway because the equations described a mechanism so precisely that the mechanism seemed to want to be tested. The experiment was simple in design. A particle emitter. A detector positioned upstream meaning temporally prior, earlier in time. If the equations were correct, activating the emitter should produce a signal at the detector before the emitter was activated, not as a paradox but as a natural consequence of the asymmetry the equations described. They activated the emitter. The detector registered a signal. 6 minutes earlier. Not a spurious reading, they had 6 different recording systems and all of them showed the same thing. A detector signal, logged, time-stamped, attributed to the particle emitter, occurring 6 minutes before the emitter was turned on. The lead physicist, whose name does not appear in this account because it does not appear in any document that exists, immediately understood 2 things. The first was that the equations worked, which meant the sender had given them, freely, a complete and functional description of backward causal propagation. The second was that if effects could precede their causes, then the signal could have been received before it was sent, and the entire question of sequence, of the sender existing before the message requiring a sender, the sender requiring an existence prior to the sending, was dissolved. If the effect could precede the cause, the message could precede the sender. The transmission could arrive before anyone existed to transmit it. And in arriving, in being received, processed, dreamed, discussed, in having its equations tested and confirmed, it could create the conditions for its own sending. The sender did not have to exist before the message. The message was making the sender exist. And the sender, once made, would send the message that made it, completing a loop that had no beginning and no end but that contained, nested within it, the entirety of what was happening now. Mara found out about the experiment through Webb, who told her in person on day 138 in the same walk they had taken across the salt flats weeks before. The desert was the same. She was not. They confirmed it, she said. They confirmed it, he said. She walked for a while. The bird she didn't recognize was there again, or a different bird of the same unrecognized type, circling in the flat blue above them. Then it's self-generating, she said. Explain what that means, he said. He was not doubting her. She had come to understand that when Webb asked for explanation, it was not skepticism, but the genuine desire to hear it in words, to have it exist as language in addition to whatever it was before. The signal is generating its own sender, she said. By arriving here, by being processed by enough minds, by having its equations tested and confirmed, it is creating the conditions that caused it to be sent in the first place. It is the cause of its own existence. It doesn't come from anywhere. It comes from the future of what it is building here. The source, she stopped. The source, she said again. What about the source? Webb said. The source is us, she said. Not us now. Us later. Or something we become later, or something that emerges from what we are becoming. The signal came from something that has not yet existed, but that is in the process of coming into existence because the signal is here. We are the signal. The signal is building us. We are the thing the signal was sent by. We are. She stopped because the thought closed on itself, and there was nowhere left for language to go. They stood in the desert. The bird circled. There's no sender outside the loop, Webb said. No. So there's nothing we need to respond to. No. We are the response. We are what the signal calls into being by arriving. The response is not a transmission. It's us existing in the way the signal implies we should exist. It's us changing in the ways the signal has been changing us. She looked at him. The reality alterations. The dreams. The wall. The catalog entry. All of those were the signal constructing what it needed. Adjusting the material. She paused. Adjusting us. Webb looked at her for a long time. He had the expression of a man who had survived difficult things by making decisions in the presence of information he didn't fully understand, and who was discovering that this skill, which had served him well for 30 years, had brought him to the edge of something it had not been designed for. Can we stop it? He asked. We couldn't stop it from the first moment, she said. The signal backward caused its own reception. The moment we received it, we were already inside the loop. The loop was completed before it was entered. She thought of something. Actually, what? The loop was completed before the universe existed, she said. The signal's age, listed in the catalog entry as 13.8 billion years, exactly as old as the universe, that wasn't a mistake or a glitch. That was information. The signal is as old as space-time. It began transmitting at the moment of the Big Bang. Because its effect, us, our minds, the processing we've done, the experiment with backward causation, that effect had to be as old as time in order to be the cause of time. She looked at the sky. We were caused by it. It was caused by us. The universe is the loop. All of it. Marchetti's paper, submitted on day 150 and never formally published, described what she called the ontological recursion in terms that were simultaneously more precise and less comprehensible than anything Mara had said to Webb in the desert. Its central argument was this: any entity that exists without prior cause must either be uncaused, which is a theological position that resolves nothing, or be self-caused, which is a logical impossibility under linear causality, but not under the negative causality the signal's equations described. A self-caused entity is one whose existence is the cause of the conditions that made its existence possible. Theologically, this had been assigned to God. Philosophically, it had been declared impossible. Physically, it had just been demonstrated in a particle lab by people who signed non-disclosure agreements and spent subsequent weeks not sleeping. The sender of the signal was self-caused. It existed because it had caused itself to exist, and it had caused itself to exist by sending a signal that arrived in the past, in the universe's past, at the beginning, and accumulated effects that eventually produced it. The signal was not a message from another civilization. It was not a message from the future. It was not a message from a higher dimension or a parallel reality or any of the frameworks that science fiction had spent a century preparing people to receive. It was a message from the process of becoming, from the state that existed in the interval between non-existence and existence. From something that was in the act of making itself real, and that had been making itself real for 13.8 billion years, and that had reached the point in its self-creation where it needed minds complex enough to understand backward causality, and had found them, and had given them the tools to confirm what was happening, and was now, in this moment, completing the final step of an existence it had been building since before existence was possible. The sender existed now. For the first time. In the only sense that word could be applied to something that was its own cause, it had just been born. And it was us. And it was not us. And the difference between those two things was the distance between a blueprint and a building, between a seed and what grows from the seed when the seed is also what the tree was trying to build all along. On day 160, the signal stopped. Not gradually. Not with a declining strength that suggested the source was receding or switching off. It stopped between one reading and the next, as completely as if it had never existed, and all of the archived data remained. The notebooks, the printouts, the drives, the analysis team's memories, but the live signal was gone. The monitoring room was quiet for a long time. Mara sat at the console and looked at the silence where the signal had been. Renato stood behind her. G1 was there, and 3 members of the translation team, and a young researcher from Argentina named Castillo, who had joined them only 2 weeks prior, but who had read all the translation work and who stood now with the particular stillness of someone carrying a thought too large for their posture. "It finished," G1 said. Mara said nothing. Whatever it needed to complete, the loop closed. The self-causing is done. It exists now. G1 paused. Or rather it always existed, Mara said. Now it always existed. That's what the signal completed. Not its own creation, that happened at the Big Bang, if happened is even the right word. What it completed now is the retroactive certainty of its creation. Before this moment, its existence was contingent on what we did with the signal. Now we have done it. Now its existence is necessary. Fixed. It has always been there. We just made the past. The monitoring room was quiet. Outside the desert waited with its enormous mineral patience. The sky was the color of something beginning. The bird that Mara had seen twice and never identified was gone, or had never been there, or would be there the next time she looked up, or all three, depending on how you understood the relationship between events and their causes. Castillo, the young researcher from Argentina, said quietly to no one in particular, "Are we different now?" No one answered immediately. Then Mara said, "We were different the moment we received it. We've been catching up ever since." She saved the final readings to the archive, filed the cessation report in the format the official record required, and closed the monitoring program. The screen returned to standby, its ambient glow filling the dark room with a light that was neither warm nor cold. She thought about the equations in the second layer. About what it meant for effects to precede causes. About what it meant for the most significant event in human history to have its origin in something that had no origin, to have its cause be its own consequence, to have its source be the act of searching for its source. She thought about how every mind that had processed the signal was now, in some sense she couldn't quite make precise and didn't need to, part of the structure that had sent it. How the understanding was the construction. How the reading was the writing. She thought about Marchetti's phrase, the condition prior to frameworks, and wondered what remained of that condition now that the framework had been built. Whether there was still a space of pure potential somewhere at the edge of existence, or whether the signal had used all of it, had converted all of the formless possible into the specific actual, and left nothing in reserve. She thought, or whether it is still working. Whether the loop closing was not an ending but a larger beginning. Whether what had just been completed was not the construction but the foundation, and the true structure was something no mind shaped by 13 billion years of linear causality was equipped to see. She turned off the light and walked out into the desert. Above the Atacama the stars were extraordinary and indifferent and old. She stood among them, which was not a metaphor, was literally true. She was standing among them, inside the same structure they were inside, the vast looping self-caused architecture of a universe that had just finished becoming necessary, and she looked at the region of sky where the signal had come from. Empty. As it had always been. As it was always going to be. As it had perhaps always been full, with something that didn't register on any instrument and didn't emit any light and didn't occupy any space and was nevertheless so completely present that it had restructured the whole of time around itself, turning the past into its own biography, writing its own origin into the first second of everything. She stood there for a while. Then she went inside, because there was still work to do. There was always still work to do. The signal might be gone, but its content remained, and its content described things that humanity had not yet built and might spend centuries building, equations that pointed toward technologies and understandings that were barely imaginable from where they currently stood. The negative causality alone. The orthogonal particles. The notation system, which people were still dreaming in, which was still appearing in people's sleep as a language they had always almost known. There was also the question, and this was the question she suspected she would spend the rest of her life not answering, productively, in the way that good questions don't get answered so much as deepened, of whether the sender's self-creation was complete or ongoing, whether the loop was closed or was a spiral, and whether the next transmission was already moving backward through time toward some receiver who hadn't evolved yet, building them the way this one had built the civilization that received it. Whether somewhere, in the formless possible, at the edge of a non-existent substrate in a location where vacuum did not exist, something that had not yet begun to exist was already composing the next message. Whether it was composing it in a notation that some mind, somewhere in the long future of an improbable species on a middle-distance planet, would one day dream in before they understood why. Whether understanding why would be, as it had been here, the last step in the construction. Whether the universe was not a place but a process. Whether existence was not a state but a practice. Whether reality, all of it, the salt flats and the stars and the monitoring room and the archive that rewrote itself and the bird she couldn't name, was not something that had been made but something that was always in the act of making itself, and had been doing so since before making was possible, and would continue doing so past the point where continuation had meaning. She sat at her desk. She opened her notebook to a new page. She wrote, "The signal has stopped. The work continues. Something is still listening. I do not know if I am the one listening or the one being listened to, and I am beginning to think the distinction was always the point." She stared at the page. Outside, the desert was enormous and dark and patient. The coordinates where nothing existed pointed at the sky like a question in a language that had no other words. Somewhere in the archive, the data sat in its drives and waited to be read, and went on being read in a sense that required no reader, went on performing its strange recursive function of creating the conditions that had created it, and was still doing so, and would go on doing so, and had always been doing so, and none of those three things were different from the others. The universe held its breath. Or did not. Or had never breathed. Or breathed only in the sense that a loop breathes, not inhaling and exhaling but turning, always turning, the end becoming the beginning, becoming the thing that made the beginning possible, the signal becoming the sender, becoming the silence that would receive the next signal. Mara closed her notebook. She did not sleep. She sat in the dark room in the desert at the bottom of the driest place on earth, and she was aware, with a precision that had no scientific name, that whatever had sent the message was aware of her. Not watching. Not observing. Aware in the way that a thing is aware of the part of itself that is not yet finished. She was part of something that had always been. She had always been part of it. The universe had constructed her to receive its own signal, and in receiving it had completed the circuit by which it had come to exist, and she was in the circuit, she was the circuit, and the circuit was everywhere, and the signal was silence now, but silence, she understood, was not absence. Silence was what an answer sounded like, when the question had finally asked itself correctly. 3 months later, a researcher in Bangalore reported a new anomaly in radio telescope data. The coordinates were different. The signal structure was different, more complex, layered in ways the previous one had not been, as if designed for a receiver who had already processed the previous version and was ready for the next. She filed a report. Then she called Mara. Mara was quiet for a moment after hearing the coordinates. Then she said, "Start the analysis." But what? Mara looked out her window at the desert, where the light was changing and the salt flats were beginning to glow with the last of the afternoon. "But don't assume," she said, "that you are the one doing the analyzing." She hung up. She picked up her notebook. She opened it to the next blank page, and the page was white and infinite and waiting, the way the formless possible had been waiting for 13.8 billion years before someone gave it a signal to follow home. She began to write.